Good morning, Chameleon Wranglers. This is Bill Strand, and I am here with Michael Nash. Hello, Michael.
Hello, good morning. Happy to be here.
This is Michael is coming back because he just does so much out there. So we're just gonna have him back. The more you do, Michael, the more you're gonna be coming back. All right.
Sounds like a fair trade. Sounds good.
All right. So what is it? Well, first of all, how are things going over on your side?
Very good, I'd say. The spring is in the air. I have a lot of native plants in my backyard, so they're all coming back up, which I'm really excited about. It means there's lots of native bees and animals and hawks, and everything's alive over here. So I'm doing really well. It's a lovely time of year and a good time to keep chameleons too.
Yeah, well, we're going to be I'm going to be talking to you more about all those grasses and stuff because I'm really enjoying these cages that I'm putting making naturalistic, and I want to. It's time to go. The plants are getting established, and so now it's time for me to start doing bioactive and starting to work with grasses and such. And so this is a lot of fun.
Awesome. Glad to hear it.
All right. Well, now that we have people streaming in here, we can unveil what it is we're actually talking about. And that is the jeweled chameleon, or Furcifer campani. And this species we generally haven't heard a whole lot about. It and I don't know why, because it's a beautiful species, but probably because when they come in as wild caught, they really aren't that hardy. But that the whole situation may change because of the efforts of Michael Nash. And Michael, I'm just going to stop talking here and let you take over and introduce us to the jeweled chameleon.
All right. Well, yeah, I'm really excited to be able to talk about these today. I say this all the time, how whatever I happen to be talking about is my favorite chameleon at that moment. But I have to say that I do think these are my favorite chameleon for real. I think uh, they're such an interesting species to keep, and I think keeping one or multiple successfully, it's a good opportunity to try to push your husbandry to the next level. It's sort of keeping these, it provides a good opportunity for you to experiment and try different things because on some levels they are very hardy, but also they're subject to these interesting environmental conditions that I think naturally pushes keepers to try different things when keeping them. So they're a very stimulating and interesting animal to have around, I'd say. But as far as chameleons, so small, right? They're easy in terms of space that they require. Totally gorgeous animals. I mean, you can see with the pictures, they're unique. They look different at baseline than I think almost any other chameleon. Just the amount of spots on them and their amazing range of colors. They're really a jeweled. I think it's a very fitting name for these wonderful little animals. So one of my favorites for sure.
Yeah, and I'm going to say there's a reason why we are focusing in on this species right now because Madagascar species, you just have so many incredible chameleons that how do you pick? Well, we're not just picking random species. Michael Nash has actually been working with this species for a while and is uh, soon, sometime this year, perhaps, I'll let him talk about timing, going to be making available multiple captive hatched bloodlines. And this is the catalyst and the ability to create a captive community, a captive species breeding community that has multiple bloodlines. And so this is why we're talking about this species today. And we're going to be moving over. I'm going to show you the sport that we're going to be doing in the Chameleon Academy is going to have a profile with the care summary, and we're going to be talking about Campani for a little while. This year, my three species that I like to raise awareness of are, first of all, the carpet chameleon, which has a a budding community growing, the Jeweled Chameleon, which is starting out, and the Johnson Eye, which we talked about last week. Now, whether Johnson Eye comes in or not, and we can start a community remains to be seen, but those are the three that we're going to be talking about. And so I'm very happy to bring in the third one, the Jeweled Chameleon here. Okay, well, let's go ahead and Michael, please give us an introduction to the males, the females, and just a basic life cycle of this guy.
Yeah, so I can speak for their life cycle in captivity, and I can speak on how they are in the wild, not based on me ever going to Madagascar, though. I want to make that clear. This is based on every bit of information I've been able to gain by speaking to anyone who's ever been in a spot where they might know about these in the wild. So I've done my very best to gather all the information I can about them in the wild. So I will comment on that, but really a lot of this comes from captive experience as well. So they hatch, from my understanding, is sort of staggered throughout the wet season of Madagascar. You can see that when you even look at the imports that come in. So when the imports come in, there's actually quite a wide variety of sizes and seemingly ages. So that leads me to believe that they sort of all pop up roughly the same time of year. But there's some variability in that range. So their climate that they come from, it's rather harsh in that there's a lot of kind of shrubs and grasslands. It's sort of a savanna, montane heathland environment. So it's quite exposed. And furthermore, they're from one of the coldest regions of Madagascar, where in the dry season, it gets down to near freezing at night. So in the wet season, when they first come out, the conditions are actually much more favorable. And it still gets cold at night, but from everything I've read, it's actually a reasonable place to spend some time if you're a tourist. So it's not it's not super unpleasant at the major time of year when there's the most of these in the wild. So with that said, their life cycle is, I think, relatively typical of most chameleons, where it's, they hatch from eggs, they reproduce in a short period of time because they're sort of all around in that wet season. Then during the dry season, there's a couple of different ideas as to what happens to them, but one is that almost all of them die. And then some other reports have suggested that they sort of hide and just wait out that dry season. But most of them don't seem to make it through that dry period every year. So to the best of my knowledge, that's more or less their life cycle.
Okay. Yeah. And for those of you following the podcast that just released on Friday was about the dry season, and Ewan Edwards, who I interviewed, gives his personal observation that he can't find any campani during the dry season. So these chameleons encounter a time that probably filters out many of all but the strongest of these species. And so they are exposed to some pretty wide range of conditions, which actually makes them a very good candidate for captive, establishing in a captive environment.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about how you house these guys. Get my presentation. Where are we going? Come on, guys. There we go.
Sure.
Hey, yeah, how do you house these?
Yeah, so I want to mention that the minimum cage size listed here is, as it suggests, a minimum, right? So you always say that with the care sheets, and I think it's an important point to drill home. But these are a really active, interesting species, so they'll use whatever space you give them, provided it's set up appropriately. With that said, I've had success keeping them in these small size enclosures, 16 by 20. And they use every bit of that space. They're small, so it's really fun to put them in an enclosure that size or maybe even bigger. So that's kind of the minimum I'd recommend for an adult. Of course, it says here, ideally, you go bigger. Now, I know a couple others might have had some success not doing bioactive with them, but I have only really done bioactive with keeping these guys. And this is, I think, really critical for allowing the babies in particular to survive. So we'll talk more about the babies a bit later, perhaps. But as far as adults, I think they really, really benefit from a bioactive setup. And as I said, they use it. They are exploring every bit of the enclosure. And frankly, it's fascinating. I'll see them some days actually waiting on the edge of plants, looking for the springtails to emerge from the leaves. And they're tiny. The springtails are, you can hardly see them, but they appear to be targeting bugs that small. So I think a bioactive setup is my ideal way of keeping them. Other than that, kind of typical chameleon things where I give them small size branches, some bigger branches, a variety of things to grip on. Grasses, I think they seem very at home in that. They tend to use the grasses and put themselves in that space. But I think a wide variety of enclosures would do well with them. But my biggest successes with them have come from bioactive setups and enclosures that are hybrid or modified to maintain humidity and heat in some way. So I've not kept these in just pure screen enclosures with no modifications. There's always something to retain some humidity pockets and allow me to control the environment a bit better. That's what I'd say kind of broadly.
All right, and I'll explain a bit when I'm putting together a little insight into when I have to put together care sheets and I have to put something down for minimum and then ideal. And what I would encourage you, if you are a keeper, you just want to keep one or just want to enjoy it, go as big as you can. When I say minimum size, that is really, it takes experience to create a chameleon environment in a small cage, because the smaller the cage, the more responsibility you have to make sure it's absolutely perfect, because the smaller the cage, the fewer gradients you can create in that small space. And so you're reducing the choices that your chameleon has. And so the larger the cage, the easier it is for you as the keeper to give the chameleon what they need to regulate their temperature and find places that they like. And so if you that minimum, I would say, is for breeders. If you're a breeder and you know what you're doing, you can create a successful chameleon habitat in 16 by 20 easily. If you're not sure about your husbandry, then go for the larger cage, because that gives you a whole lot more leeway to learn, and you can watch the behavior of your chameleon. You'll start to get a feel for what it takes to make an optimal cage by watching your chameleon, and that just takes time. So when you're looking at these care summaries, keep that in mind. Don't go for the minimum unless you're a breeder and you have that experience.
Yeah, I couldn't agree
Any
more.
comment?
There's one thing I'd like to mention about this that I forgot to say. So the picture on the right is this nice kind of PVC enclosure that doesn't allow them to climb up on the screen unless the plants grow all the way up to the screen. And I think in this species in particular, and frankly, probably many species, if you have some way to restrict them from climbing up under the screen, I think that is a good idea. So hybrid enclosures with PVC sides have the added advantage where animals can't climb up them like they can
Mhm.
screen. So what this lets you do is modify your environment so that you don't need to worry so much about what exposure they would get on the screen if they simply can't get there. And for this species in particular, I think that's really critical because maybe we'll talk about it more later, but they seem to be attracted to whatever the brightest light in the enclosure
Mhm.
is. So if that happens to be a UV light, I think, yeah, I could speak more about this, but something happens where they get kind of glued under that bright light. And I think that can preclude their ability to auto-regulate successfully because it's an artificial system. So
Yeah.
if you can, I think it's a good idea to either limit the amount of heat and UV that is present at the very top. So if they do get up there, they're not going to get hurt as bad, or just cut the issue entirely and keep them from getting under the screen. And that's where the hybrid enclosures also come in to make that an easier prospect.
Yeah, and I'll say with our increasing awareness of how important hydration is and humidity is within the chameleon environment, hybrid cages are becoming the cage of choice. And we're looking at screen cages and saying, I'm not even sure how we can make that work unless we create a hybrid cage out of it. So you're all seeing a shift in the community awareness and understanding of chameleon husbandry. And well, personally exciting to me that we're moving forward, but it just means that things change. So,
Yep.
all right. Uh, So generally speaking, and everybody don't try to magnify your screen. Don't worry, we're going to go over each and every aspect on this care summary. But generally speaking, if someone is experienced with panther chameleons, how big of a switch over do you think it would be for them to get used to the jeweled chameleon?
I'd say it's comparable to switching to a lateralis, and I mean that in the way that the size is similar. There's some special considerations with the species. It's maybe like a tricky. It's about comparable to switching to a female lateralis. I'll say that for the
Okay.
species in general.
All right. All right.
So it's not, a ridiculous jump, but there's some extra things that you want to be aware of and think about, which frankly I think would improve husbandry for things like panthers and veils and so on. So I think these encourage you to look more closely at what you're doing, but it's not necessarily harder to keep them. So
Yes.
like a tricky
I
carpet.
I am 100% confident that all of the skills that we are developing in keeping these little guys we're going to step back and we're going to go backwards and apply them to our panther chameleons, and we're going to find that our panther chameleons are going to do a whole lot better. So
Mhm,
this is a great exercise for us in the community.
mhm.
uh, so let's talk about temperature. And I'm going to let me preface this and say that, as you know, people listening to the podcast, I'm raising awareness as to there being seasons in a chameleon's life. And this
Mhm.
is something that I'm personally exploring. And of course, because I have a podcast, I'm dragging you all with me as I raise awareness within myself and the community of seasons. So instead of us giving our chameleons the endless perfect summer, uh, perhaps that isn't perfect. Perhaps they need a cool down period. And uh, this here with campani, we are I am starting to explore this with the work done by Michael Nash in how to best keep them. And so, with the temperature, you're seeing a winter and a summer breakdown, and I'm going to be rolling this out slowly to all the other species. But for today, let's go ahead and talk about temperature for the jeweled chameleon.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that seasonal variations are quite important in keeping this species as well as a number of others. And I won't list off all the other species that I'm referring to, but I feel that employing at least some seasonal variation just tends to help keep these animals if done reasonably. And that is a big question. What does that mean, doing this reasonably?
Mhm.
So I'm not talking about frying them in the summer and then just freezing them and having them almost die in the winter. Obviously, we don't want to do that, but
Yep.
you even see it with plants and so many forms of life. Venus flytraps, pitcher plants, black bear, whatever. Multiple plants. If you don't give them a cool down period, they'll do fine, right? They'll keep growing, but they tend to die early. So,
Yep.
in my opinion, the seasonal variation that you offer is really you making a choice as to, well, do I want this animal to just have a really action packed shorter life, or do we want kind of a long term experience? um, so these have worked great for me. I think if someone kept them warmer all the time, you could define that as being successful with them if they reproduce and so on, but I'm quite certain it leads to them dying earlier. So it's a
Mhm.
trade-off. Do you want them to go fast, have a bunch of eggs, and then you crash, or do you want kind of a more sustainable, gradual series of life events for the animals? And that's the kind of psychology I apply to keeping most of these. So with that tangent aside, I'll focus on what I do for them. So in the day, in the winter, in Colorado, the winter is kind of long. Really, it doesn't get that warm in terms of ambient temperatures. It's maybe 70 degrees during the day, maybe a little colder, a little warmer, but pretty not that hot. Whereas in the summer, the ambient temperatures overall rise, and I also increase the humidity in the summer. So in the summer, things are warmer and a little bit more humid. Now, I think a really important aspect of the species is to pay attention to the nighttime drops that are listed here. So I have it listed to 50. I have taken them down to maybe 35 Fahrenheit, and that was an accident. That I didn't mean for it to get that cold that night, but it was, Colorado is sort of wacky with the seasons, and they were fine. They were totally fine. So I don't recommend people do that, but just to give you an idea of their range of tolerance, it's quite broad. So in my house where I keep them, indeed, it gets down to 50, maybe 55 at night in the winter. I can speak as to how that's accomplished if we want, but pretty cold overall. They warm up a bit during the day, but it's cold at night, mild during the daytime. And then in the summer, there's still a nighttime drop, but it's not nearly as significant. It's maybe 65, 64, 61. And I think that level of nighttime drop is pretty reasonable for a number of people to get in their house. I don't think necessarily we need to take them down to like 45, 50 to get them to live a long time, but a cool down should be implemented at nighttime whenever possible for longevity, is based on my experience. One thing I also want to mention is that the basking, it doesn't really change that much, depending on what time of year I have them. And a comment about that, the basking temperature, I think, is not actually that important. We have a range here. I don't think if you go 87, they're just going to die. And likewise, low 80s versus 86, I don't think it really makes that big a difference. This is a pretty good range to shoot for, though. This is all for adults, by the way. So you see on the right for humidity, in the day, it gets a little lower, 40, 50. In the summer, it might be a bit higher. At night, high humidity, really important. It's actually not as hard to obtain as some people might think. Really, all you have to do is just turn the lights off. And if you have a hybrid enclosure, it sort of naturally raises the temperature, or rather humidity. So I cycle these seasonally, and that is more or less out of convenience because I keep them in a couple rooms of the house that don't have any insulation. And that was a pity when I was trying to figure out why is my energy bill so high, but I was able to leverage it and allow them to get really cool at night. So that has allowed me to experiment with these parameters, and this is the range I've been successful with. So,
And I'd like to say for the humidity, when I'm putting together these care summaries, I have to put down a number. I have to put down something that other people can work off of and target. But when we're talking about humidity, and this is for all chameleon species, what we're looking for is an effect. We are looking for the ability to hydrate during the night to where the point where we're not losing hydration from breathing. And so that's why we go to a very high humidity at night. During the day, going down to those levels, 40 to 50%, it's not because the chameleon needs that dip in humidity. It's because we need it to create a healthy cage environment, because we're always in this balancing act of hydrating the chameleon, but not encouraging growth of bacteria, fungus, and mold. And so it's always that balancing act. And that's why we do the high humidity at night. I mean, that's what happens in nature, but that's when it's cool. And so the growth of the bacteria and fungus and mold is suppressed because of the temperature, but the chameleon can get their hydration. During the day, we have the humidity go down, so all the surface is dry, and that retards the growth of bacteria, fungus, and mold. And so that's really the effect we're looking for. So if you've got your cage and you're reading your numbers and they are 55% humidity during the day, oh no, I'm off of the care sheet. Yeah, don't worry about the actual numbers. What's important is you look at the cage. Are the branch surfaces dry? Are the cage surfaces dry? And so that's what you're looking for. It's the effect of this rise and fall, not necessarily the numbers themselves. Um, and I'd also like to say, when we're talking about temperatures and we're talking about a cool down during the winter, there is an insidious part of our brain that thinks that bigger and faster is always better. While it is true in some cases, that has not served us well when it comes to chameleon husbandry, especially like with veiled chameleons. It is very easy to supercharge your veiled chameleon with temperature and food and grow this big monster and then go on social media and say, see what my husbandry parameters have given me, this incredible, wonderful, healthy monster. And of course, the effect is wow. And so we want to go for the big, healthy monster. But the problem is that is shortening their life. And so we as a community need to raise our awareness that the glitz isn't always the best. And we're starting to look into the details of how to keep them longer. And so be aware that number one, you're going to have a lot of people saying, being really excited about their big chameleon. Be aware that that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. And also, if we go for a longer lived chameleon, the growth may be slower. And so that is kind of the trade-offs in understanding what is and isn't important in our husbandry. So that's a little high level insight there. Michael, we have a couple of questions that are actually relevant to what we're talking about. So, hey, 2 thumbs up in the chat. We have one asking about how do you feel about keeping them in exoterras, like the 18 by 18 by 36?
Yeah, so I've done it in glass a little bit. Most of what I've had is hybrid enclosures or modified enclosures, but I think glass works great. As long as they have that ventilation in the front. So when you look at the enclosures I use, really the ventilation that I offer is pretty similar to a glass enclosure in that there's just some holes in the front, right, to allow for that chimney effect and everything. I would say, just in case, you might want to get a couple small fans. Just if you notice any problem, like, oh, it's too humid, you need more airflow, a little tiny computer fan that sort of pushes the air through it, that can really help. But I think, yeah, keeping them in a glass enclosure would work great. And that, again, helps you prevent them from getting on top of the screen or under the screen, I should say. I think that worked great. And, there is precedent for keeping small chameleons, like carpet chameleons, in glass enclosures. Like Frank Payne, he's keeping, I think, most of his, or he has been keeping a lot of his in the past anyway, in glass enclosures. He's done amazing with it. So the glass enclosures for small chameleons should always be on the table, I think. I think they do very well in them. So just some other considerations, of course, different than a full screen enclosure where there's constant airflow. Just keep an eye on it, but it should work well.
Okay. And let's talk about the low nighttime drop. I know this is something that bothers a lot of people because, of course, with Jackson's chameleons, we need the low nighttime drop. So this is universal. How do you get a low nighttime drop?
Yeah, so I have two approaches, I suppose. So one thing is I happen to be, well, lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. But as I mentioned, I have a room on the side here that the realtor didn't tell me, but happens to not have any insulation. So what that means is it gets cold because I'm in Colorado and near the mountains here, and it gets cold at night. I happen to like it cold in my house. So I don't mind setting the thermostat to 50 or 55, but
Mhm.
it just naturally tends to get cold in one of the rooms I have. So I can make it even colder by rerouting my heating a little bit. I have baseboard heating, and you can kind of change the output to different rooms. So one could do that if you're able to change how much heat is getting to the room overall. That can help, but more practical approaches that don't rely on just an open room essentially that I've used are things like opening a window at night, just a crack enough to sort of cool the room. That works really well. In addition to that, there's evaporative coolers, and those work very well as well. And those have the added benefit of increasing the humidity a little bit. So in combination with maybe opening a window, an evaporative cooler can really do a lot of good. You can do things like add ice to it to really cool it off. And again, if we're talking about a hybrid enclosure, which is a much more controlled space, it's a lot easier to get a cool down than you think, because you just sort of aim the cooler towards it and it just holds it as cold. So there's maybe two broad approaches I'd say that I use to get it cold at night. One is make the room cold, right? A montane room. The other is leverage the ease of controlling the environment of small closed enclosures and cool that enclosure down with a targeted approach like an evaporative cooler or a window. So that's
Okay.
generally what I use, but also spraying, misting, not fogging, but misting. That cools it off as well. And especially when you have all these little microclimates and little corners where it's hidden under plants and things like that, it can get a lot colder if you keep it moist at night with spraying, for instance. And that's what you probably are doing anyway. So if you're concerned about nighttime drop, I would consider getting a small, maybe waterproof thermometer that you can track with your phone, and you can actually put it in the enclosure somewhere for a couple nights and track over time. Well, in that spot, is it actually getting cold? It might be better than you think. So,
Okay. And then a question about pea plants. Why
mhm.
pea plants?
Yeah, so they're dirt cheap, which is one major reason, and they grow very fast and they're easy to grow. So, I mean, lots of people grow peas in the spring and fall when it tends to be a bit cooler, but they do well in the summer too. So, you can grow them in many different conditions, and they grow really quick. So when setting up a bioactive enclosure, I like to stagger the rates that the plants come in to sort of encourage competition with the plants and make it more reflective of an ecosystem. Pea plants are great because they pop up right away. So they're super fast and they grow quick. So that's that first wave of establishing the ecosystem, right? But in addition to that, their stems actually make really good perches, right? For small species. And when they die, what you're left with is a natural network of small vines through the enclosure that were basically free. And you can sort of just position the pea plant to grow in whatever way you want that vine to be present. Um,
Where
so,
do you get pea plants?
I mean, you can just buy them from just a big bulk pack if you want from a number of online suppliers. Just buy peas and they germinate really easily. Just keep them in wet soil, and the soil should be wet anyway. And yeah, and another sorry aspect about pea plants that Carl Cattell sort of turned me on to was that they make a great host plant for certain species of aphids. And many
Ah,
people might be kind of afraid of, oh,
oh
aphids, I
no,
want to get
aphids
rid of
are
them.
good.
Yeah, aphids are. I wish I had more aphids because they get eaten. They like candy. Chameleons and the babies especially like to eat them. So pea plants are great because if you seed them with a few aphids, you can sort of establish the predator-prey relationship in that enclosure, and that works great for babies. And it tends to work itself out. It's not really an infestation like you imagine it might be. So a number of reasons I like to use pea plants.
And question about pea plants as to whether they are veiled safe. I don't know of any. I don't. I have had no experience with them veiled eating pea plants, but then again, I've not had any experience with a veiled being poisoned by any plant they've eaten.
I would
So,
suspect, like, this is a bit of a stretch. I've never seen a veiled eat it, but I have seen isopods in some of my enclosures eating and totally gut loading themselves with pea plants, right, that have fallen. And then I observed a chameleon eating all of them after they
okay.
gut loaded themselves with the pea plant, and nothing happened. So I suspect it's probably safe based on a non-veiled species eating all these gut loaded with pea plant isopods. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Let's go on to UVB.
Mhm. Yeah. So these animals appear to be very, very tolerant of UVB. And I found that when given the option, they'll use ranges from 1 to 7 UVI regularly. And those are my observations, but I will say they might be confounded with that UV light being the being the brightest spot in the enclosure. So I'm not going to go into a full review of all the papers that have been published on this, but some work by Gary Ferguson actually suggests that chameleons have a hard time regulating their UV exposure to optimal levels if lighting is the limiting factor. So if you just put a UV light above them and there's no other bright light or any other distraction, for lack of a better term, it's possible that what they're doing is just being drawn to that environment and that brightness. And then it looks like, oh, well, they're seeking out that UV. But there might be a confounding factor because we're not playing with a system that is truly reflective of what they experience in the wild. So
Mhm.
I would say for UV, you want to provide another bright light so you can sort of disentangle UV exposure from bright light exposure, and that makes a
Mm.
nicer enclosure anyway. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
And I'll say when the UVB is a very huge challenge when putting together care summaries because our application of light is grossly imperfect. And so we split the sun into three different lights: heat, white light, and UVB. And the chameleon, who knows what the chameleons interpret all of that and make of all of that. Obviously, they live, and so they're able to live long lives, but we need to be careful in interpreting their behavior and their reaction to the lights that we provide
Mhm.
because it's totally different than what they have evolved over millions of years to expect and react to. So when it comes down to figuring out what UV index to put on a care summary, I
Mhm.
like to go to something outside of behavior, and that's to the calcification of eggs. That is the number one time in a chameleon's life when they are required to produce calcium, and so that's a good milestone as to what the minimum effective UV index is that a chameleon can produce a fully calcified clutch of eggs without dietary D3.
Mhm.
And so when I have that number, that's like gold. And so when Michael says on his in his findings that he has a female that produced fully calcified eggs at a UV index of 3, I just latch onto that and say, okay, we've got something that is not dependent upon chameleon behavior. And so
Mhm.
that is why UV index 3 shows up on this care summary.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that we found that to be the case with panther chameleons and veiled chameleons. And these are chameleons from vastly different elevations. So UV index 3 seems to be a good level. Now, we're not going to assume that that's going to be the same for all chameleon species. And of course, it's difficult to figure out what a good UV index is for live bearing species because, yeah, once again, that's now all behavior, and the health of the babies can be attributed to almost anything. So um, that's where these numbers come from. And Michael has shown that. And Michael, talk a little bit about how you tested out UV index of 3.
Yeah. So in this species or in general?
In this species.
Sure. Yeah. So what I did is it was dual fixture bulbs, right? Or rather, it has spots for 2 bulbs in the fixture. T5 high output, just it's nice technology. So one 6500K bulb, and then one, whether it's a 6% or 10% at an older age, I don't think it matters much as long as you're testing the UV index, right? So it's about the index, not the tools necessarily.
Right.
So when I offered that bright light, and I didn't make it so UV was the limiting light factor, I would offer a UV index 3 at a branch it was clearly the best the best spot for them to be basking. It was multiple different branches, but it was all at a level that it was easy to obtain an accurate reading. So offered 3, and after a few months, eggs, no problems. Baby's very healthy. So 3 works well. In the past, like when I first started with the species, I offered 7 and 6, and that seemed to work too. But I did notice that those animals maybe didn't live as long, and there were some other differences in my husbandry back then. So I can't attribute it only to UV, but if they do fine with UV3 and they make eggs, even if I've observed them utilizing UV6, 7, whatever, it can be damaging, and we don't know the long-term implications of it. So if you have a system where you're able to experiment and you are confident that UV light itself isn't the light limiting factor, meaning there's other bright light, I encourage people to experiment a little bit and maybe try slightly higher. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the clutch size will increase and it'll still be healthy for the female. We don't know what the ultimate changes are going to be based on modulating UV exposure. I'd say 3 is a good starting point because it worked. And even though they use higher exposures, the long-term benefits of that are unclear at this time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I kind of tested it.
It's important for us to realize that UVB is not benign. It kills cells, it damages cells, and this is nature is a very strange beast where everything that it gives us that benefits us will also kill us. And so those of us trying to figure out husbandry parameters, we have to find that line. And since UVB damage is subtle and happens over time, it is wise of us to figure out what the minimum UVB that's effective. It doesn't mean, and when I say minimum effective, people respond with, well, I want to make sure, and so I'm going to give more UVB. No.
Yeah.
When they give a fully calcified clutch of eggs, that is an effective dose. It doesn't mean we're on the edge of not being effective. It's effective. It means that there is no reason that we know of at this time to go beyond that. And we don't know where the line is to where it's starting to become damaging and life shortening. And so it's not a good idea to go in that direction. Now, if sometime in the future somebody says, well, I found that we get this benefit at a higher UVB, and and then that's something that we can in the community can test, then okay, we have discovered something. But at this point, there's nothing beyond UVI3 that is shown to give benefit. So that's why we try to give as low a level as possible that is 100% effective.
One other thing I want to mention about the UV briefly, I know I'm going over time here, I'm sure, but I think that this species, logically, based on what we know about them in the wild, I think they're very tolerant of high UV levels. And in captivity, they seem to be the same. They seem to be tolerant of it. And I want to stress that doesn't mean that it's somehow better for them to be blasted by it, right? Like a bearded dragon is tolerant of dry conditions. That does not mean don't give it water, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's the same for these guys. They seem to be tolerant of it. The environment logically would suggest that they're very tolerant of high UV, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better to blast them with it. And one other comment I want to make is one of the few species that overlaps in range with Furcifer campani is lateralis carpet chameleons. And this paper will be out in June, herpetological review. I did it in collaboration with Chris Anderson. I just want to plug this. It's coming out relatively soon. We tested different UV levels on offspring growth rates in Furcifer lateralis, the carpet chameleon. And as I said, they occupy, or their range overlaps with jeweled chameleons. So it stands to reason that their level of tolerance for UV might be similar to the jeweled chameleon since their ranges do overlap. And what I found, or what we found, is that higher UV levels, UVI6, actually slows down their growth compared to UVI3. So even though, again, logically, oh, well, their environment has high UV and they're probably exposed to it a lot, providing that to hatchlings slows their growth. So that's just another line of evidence that just because it's present in the environment doesn't mean in our hands at all applications, it's going to be beneficial. So I'd actually go a little lower based on that study versus higher, despite their apparent tolerance of high levels.
Okay. Now here's a favorite slide of mine because Michael has a different approach to basking, which I like very much, and I'm going to experiment with myself. Michael, please give us a snapshot of 24 hours in the life of the Jeweled Chameleons that you take care of.
Yeah, sure. So this is pretty spot on as far as the things I do. So of course, this follows a typical sort of hydration regimen where it's more misting or maybe fogging in the evening, at nighttime, letting it dry out a bit during the day. I will say that in the summer, I might add a couple supplemental mistings during the day, but it's generally not a good idea to mist when it's hot with the light on because there's a number of reasons. There's talk about bacterial infections, but also if the heat light is on and you're misting, you can just get water on the bulb and it can blow up. It's just not generally a good practice, I think. So again, we follow that typical kind of hydration regimen. But as far as basking that I offer it a few times a day. In the past, I've offered it all the time. I don't know that that's necessary though. And something I do is that I offer it throughout the day for short intervals. And I think that the length, it can be variable, but I do is about half an hour for each increment. And doing it this way, so some basking at maybe 10 a.m., some middle of the day at 1, some in the late afternoon, 4-ish, what I've found is that encourages the animals to move around their enclosure, seek out the heat, switch spots. It prevents them from just stagnating and staying stuck under one spot because we're offering more conditions to them at different intervals, encouraging utilization of the cage, encouraging movement and stimulation, right? So again, I haven't quantified that, but that's what I've found and that's what I've done. And I found it works for other species as well. So multiple small basking opportunities throughout the day, it seems to encourage their activity, encourage usage of the enclosure, and it works for raising them and keeping them. So there's lots of approaches to this that might work. I enjoy doing it this way. It saves power. It encourages them to use more of the enclosure. I think it's a good practice. So
I like it. I'm going to experiment with it.
great.
All right, let's go on to feeding these guys. They're small and they got small heads. How do we feed them?
Yeah. So, should I transition to talking about the raising the babies, which has been historically the hardest part of establishing the species, or should I just stick to adults and we'll talk
No,
talk about the
sure. Yeah,
babies?
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So, uh, as far as feeding, I feed them as much as possible when they're growing. As far as adults and gravid females in particular, I do not feed them very much. And I think as a group, chameleons are very overfed. And it's hard to see that, right? It's hard to see it because their fat depots are kind of hidden, and often it presents with maybe a random cause of death or something that would be hard to even understand if you don't have a full pathologist, necropsy workup. So I think obesity is a problem with chameleons in general. But anyway, that's kind of a tangent. So babies, I feed them all the time. Importantly, I feed them a variety of feeders, and I find that that can really encourage their feeding response. I think they'd probably do fine if you fed them only fruit flies for a while, but I found the much better results to offer springtails, 4 different types and colors, or maybe 5 colors of fruit flies, pinhead crickets, maybe aphids. I use these really interesting little parasitic wasps. They're parasitic of fly pupae, and they're really tiny. They're black. And again, these are flying tiny insects, completely harmless, but I imagine pretty similar to what they eat in the wild. And I find that when I offer all of these different feeders, there might be a bunch of babies in an enclosure and a fruit fly walks right by them. They don't even notice it, don't do anything. They're not interested, but throwing something different that's stimulating to them seems to encourage them to eat a lot. And I've actually never had a baby that just didn't eat, especially if you switch out the food items. It gains their interest and they tend to eat pretty well. So yeah, babies, variety of food I think is important for keeping them eating on track and getting them out of that danger zone from an inch long to a bigger size. As far as adults though, mm, they will eat and eat and eat, and they'll scramble over themselves to eat a fruit fly. They eat small stuff. They'll try big stuff too. And there's lots of pictures in the wild of them eating big grasshoppers, and it's amazing they could even get it down their throat. But they like to eat. So I think it's really important to limit that to really just a few bugs every other day, every several days even. And honestly, sometimes if I'm out of town, they just won't eat for about a week, and they'll just have to find springtails if they want something.
Okay.
And I think that's good. I think fasting is a normal thing, and I've not seen any negative consequences of doing it. So, less generally is more. For gravid animals, I would not recommend just letting them fast for a week. I don't think that's good practice, but you want to give them something consistently. So every other day is fine, but certainly not every day unless they're a baby. Um, and I think smaller prey items like a bunch of flies are preferable to just big, huge, hulking crickets.
Yeah.
They have eyes bigger than their stomach. So I, for an adult, I probably wouldn't go much more than maybe half an inch cricket. Even that's maybe a little bit big. But yeah, flies of all types, they love them. Worms, they kind of have to be trained a little bit to eat worms. They don't seem to readily recognize them as prey items, but they are remarkably they pick up very well on who feeds them. So once they put it
Okay.
together that you're giving them crickets, you can kind of trick them into eating worms. I would say that I've had a couple instances where I fed them too many worms, I believe, and some of them came out indigested or undigested, and that includes silkworms, which are traditionally thought of as something that is easy to digest. So I would not overload them with worms. I would always offer some other more chitinous prey items at the same time as
Okay.
worms. Chitinous being just the exoskeleton, the general kind of roughage. So, yeah, that's
Okay.
generally how it's feeding.
Now, I want to on the website, there's going to be a lot more information as far as breeding. For this episode here, I don't want to go into the details of breeding because that would take another hour. And so let's talk high level. So we have people who may be interested in being part of this community, and
Mhm.
to be, I mean, uh, you can be part of this community whether you're keeping one or you're wanting to be a breeder. So we need people who just want to keep these for enjoyment and as pets. And so if you're not a breeder, that doesn't mean you shouldn't keep a jeweled chameleon. So we need both. But for the
Mhm.
people who are interested in looking at this species as a breeding project, high level, what should they consider? How hard is it?
Yeah, so I'd say breeding them is comparable to breeding carpet chameleons, maybe a little harder. And that is because largely what is available is wild caught. And these animals, their colors are so variable, it's very difficult to ascertain whether they're gravid or receptive or sick, or you can't really tell much about what's going on with them based on their color. So because of that, it has been hard to breed them because they're wild caught animals, you know? So uh, that I think has complicated things as far as captive bred animals or young animals that have come in as wild caught. It's far easier. So I found the males are actually generally pretty aggressive breeders, and they'll just change to this incredible color palette and just jump and go for it. What's been a bigger issue for me is the females not being receptive, and again, that's complicated by dealing with wild caught animals for the most part. However, when you raise them up, it's far easier to trigger breeding. If you get a small one and you just let it grow, it tends to happen without issue. Most of the problems that have been historically documented with breeding them have been, I think, a result of dealing with wild caught animals that definitely have a seasonal cycle in the wild that very few people have tried to replicate. So it tends to work pretty well. Gestation seems to be highly dependent on temperature. And in fact, I've had an animal breed and go a whole year without laying eggs because it was, or well, okay, 9 months, but almost a year. And I think that was because I simulated a winter period for it. When I heated her up, eggs showed up. So it's my
Okay.
opinion that they can sort of delay ovulation and delay reproduction, even if they mated well before, and then just have the eggs develop whenever it's appropriate. So I think they store sperm over quite a bit of time as well. So if you want to breed them, pay attention to keeping them warm, as far as the care sheet, not blasting them, and sort of taking that cycling into account. But once they're established, they breed really quite readily. Getting them to lay is a lot like letting carpets lay, and once they're going and you have them on a good cycle, they're fine. So with captive bred animals, I think it'll be comparable to carpet chameleon breeding.
If somebody was interested in keeping one, what is the difference between male and female as far as just keeping him?
So very little. I mean, their personalities are pretty similar. Maybe females are a little bit more personable in terms of being less fearful, but they're pretty nice. I mean, I may be anthropomorphizing a little bit, but they don't seem to really have that much of a natural fear of humans. Like many other species will just jump off the branch if you get near them, especially as wild caughts. But I've never ever, in many wild caught jeweled chameleons I've never had one that was so afraid of me on day one or two that it wouldn't come up and look at the cricket in my hand. They're actually both sexes. They're pretty personable. So I think
Okay.
they're great to keep. And oh,
All
one thing I
right.
should mention, they unless again you totally overheat them or you just feed them constantly, they're not really prone, in my experience anyway, to dropping in fertile clutches.
Okay.
So They will
And how
scatter.
big are their clutches?
Uh, so I'd say a ballpark, maybe 6 to 18. I mean, I've had extremes on both sides, but 6 to 18. So manageable. I mean, a manageable size clutch. Not 60, 100, just a good number. Yeah.
All right. So let's now, and I'm going to get to this slide I'm looking for. If people are interested in becoming, learning more about Furcifer campani, where can they go for information? And I'm putting two sources up there. There's the Chameleon Academy on the care summary. There's a QR code that'll get you to the profile page, which as of the release of this episode, I'm still working on filling out all the information. So the basics are there.
Mm-hmm.
And then tell us about this Facebook group.
Yeah. So yeah, I take a look at that that Facebook group, the Furcifer Campani community. I'll be posting there quite a bit. We have one for Elliot's Chameleon, a couple others as well. So if you're part of that group, you know that I really enjoy the chance to engage more specifically about this species or one species in particular. I do want to mention, as far as further research opportunities, I have I think it's a 13-page document detailing kind of my overall experiences with this species as well as other chameleon species, in kind of a more scientific format, where I summarize the literature that's available to us, how I've taken that information to try to improve my care parameters and so on. So it's a scientific paper. It's rather lengthy, and it contains a lot of information that I've gathered from keeping them. And that is currently under review at the academic journal. So meaning editors are looking at it. We're getting it sort of polished up to see if it's publishable at this time. When that is available, I'll let people know. As you might have gathered, I talk a lot about these animals, and it might be easier to just read it in addition to listening. So if anyone's interested, I will make that available, or I'll at least put the link out there when it is published and accepted. It's currently in the review stage right now, though.
Yeah, I think the Facebook group, if you're interested, go to that one. And as soon as this is published, you will hear a lot about it on that group. Now,
And also, of course, the Chameleon Academy. I mean, Bill and I are working, mostly Bill, honestly, on putting together these great care guides and, sort of a summary of their care and all of that. So Chameleon Academy is an amazing site, or rather source of information. So certainly don't want to let that major contribution fall by the wayside. So
oh
keep an eye
no,
out there.
yeah, we're on Chameleon Academy, and yeah, that's really the outward face to the community and the people, the doorway for people to come in. But since you guys are watching this video, you go to the next step and go to that Facebook group, Furcifer campani community, and that's where you're going to get the inside story from the main breeder himself. What's the timeline, and what kind of availability are we looking at for captive hatched?
Yeah, so I'm sending a few of them out in the next few weeks to people. I've been in contact with this or about this for a long time. I think it's important to get them to people who want to breed them and people who will sort of make them more in the public eye or put them more in the public eye. So the first groups of them are going out pretty soon. After that, I have a lot more that are hatching, but since it's at somewhat early stages, I am holding on to a number of them. So they will be available. Certain bloodlines are going to be more well represented than others because of just clutch sizes and things like that. But over time, I intend to make every one of the bloodlines I have available. And as of now, if everything goes well, I think that's up to like 9 or 11. So quite a few different pairings going. The first kind of set of animals out is going to be from maybe 1 or 2 bloodlines just to get them sort of out there. But keep an eye out over the coming months. I'll make more and more available from different pairings. Yeah, so I think we'll maybe mention something about that on the Facebook group. But
Yeah, so this is what we're doing here. This is starting the awareness, and right now there's an initial. The way this works is when you have the initial group of captive hatched, those go out to other breeders who will get started. So you have your second generation of breeders, and then it starts going to the third generation of breeders and the general public who want them as pets. And so we have this tiered effect. Right now we're on the first generation breeder, and the second generation breeders are starting to uh, get up and going. So it won't be long before we're able to build a community around the Furcifer campani, and this would be a great project to get involved in if you're thinking about getting involved in a breeding project, say in the next year or so.
Mhm.
So,
Great.
all right, let's open it up to questions. We are coming to the end. Oh, well, we're past the end of the hour, but let's open it up to questions, and go ahead and put it into the chat. Give us whatever
Mhm.
questions you'd like to give to Michael here.
Actually, there's a couple of things. So I'm happy to stay on here for 10 more hours. I know not everyone else does, but a couple of key things I think I should mention about the species that I didn't manage to touch on. Just I want to do Q&A, but I think it's very important to cover this. So fogging, I think, is generally good, right? I think it has its place in husbandry, and I think it does help ensure that high humidity at night and help with hydration. I will say that these are small animals, right? They're tiny, and a fogger has the capacity to blast them with way too thick of a fog stream at actually exactly where the fog comes out. If you're talking an animal that's an inch long, like a baby, or an adult that's, oh wow, 5 inches, very small, and it happens to sit right in the fog stream right at the top, I've noticed that they have the potential. They sometimes will just get a respiratory infection or
Mm,
some distress doing that. And I think that's a function of our tools that we have to
yeah.
offer fogging. Because I use like 3/4 inch PVC, and there's a lot of volume, and then it disperses. But if they happen to sit right in it, I think it can be too much. So if you want to fog with them, I would say pay attention to the thickest point of fog in the enclosure and make sure that if they go in there, that's not going to overload them. So I think it's not that fog is not useful for them. I think our tools are dangerous in a sense that maybe they're more established for kind of bigger creatures that can deal with the fog better. So
Yeah.
that's an important consideration.
Just like UVB, just like a basking light, our tools just way too intense at the
Mhm.
beginning. So,
Yeah.
all right. How about deparasitization for wild caughts? What does that look like?
Yeah, sure. So, uh, generally speaking, the way I handle wild caughts, and I have a lot of wild caught chameleons that I've acclimated. It I run my own fecals, the fecal floats. So it's relatively. I think it's cost effective because the microscope is not that expensive, and if you have a little bit of time, I think it can really help you out. So what I do is I pool all the poop from the whole group that I brought in, and I just do a general screen that way to see, well, what types of parasites or eggs or whatever are in these animals. Are there any? And any positive, right? Any, oh, there's a big bunch of pinworm eggs, whatever. That lets me look more closely. Okay, there's something here. I should consider treatment. And ideally, you want to discuss that with a vet because there's certain levels of parasites that might be a problem, might not be a problem. The treatment needs to be weighed. Maybe it's going to make them sicker. You have a lot to consider. However, I found that batching the stool samples, doing a fecal float, identifying individuals that seem to either be maybe not doing as well or have a high parasite burden, I will treat them with Panicure. Uh, I've not had coccidia with them, thankfully. Uh, in general, I found that their parasite loads when they come in are pretty low. It's really not that bad. and I've had a lot of them. So I will, if there is a clinical need that I can identify, ideally with the help of a vet. Yeah,
Okay.
not always though.
Do you know of anybody else working with this species?
Yeah, Carl Cattell hatched a couple of them recently. Uh, there's a couple people that I'm sending some animals to that will be working with them. The captive bred ones. Sean McNeely, I know he recently got a group of the wild caughts. But as far as regular production of them in captivity, I think I have the most animals right now. So,
Okay.
and the people I've mentioned, I don't want to speak for them about, oh, you should contact them to ask for availability. I'm not sure about that. But
Okay.
yeah, there'll be more popping up that will make it clear how they wish to integrate in this effort.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
How long have you been breeding campani?
A few years. Yeah, just a few years. I mean, it's 2019, I guess. So I had a bit of a learning curve with the species because if you treat them like a panther, they will just lay eggs and burn out, right? So I've been
Okay.
learning for a few years about them. I'd say I haven't been breeding them for 20 years. Madagascar only recently reopened anyway, but
Yeah.
I think it's I've learned a lot in that time about them.
Do you have an idea of the life expectancy?
Yeah, so I have had wild caught females live approaching a couple years. So that's a wild caught female that went through the ringer. I think that's a good sign. Now, and the cause of death for her, or for that particular long-lived one, that was a freak accident, and I think she would have lived longer. I would say just a ballpark is comparable to Lateralis, like a few years. However, I think Jurgen was the one that told me about this, but there's some reports of the males living pretty long. I think 7 years is what he said. So
Okay.
I haven't been working with them for 7 years, so I can't speak to that. But I think giving them the husbandry that ensures longevity in them, meaning maybe a cool down period, I think they have some potential to live longer than Lateralis, maybe 5 years. I'd say at minimum three,
Okay.
2 to 3. So,
And what is your success rate with the juveniles?
about 100. I mean, they all make it. I've had, well, actually, this is a really good, not quite 100 for a really interesting reason, and that is, I think a hurdle with keeping some of these rare species is people will incubate them, and the success is determined by, will they hatch? But I think in reality, the success about breeding a species is measured in long-term success of the offspring. So what I found, I had a really unfortunate thing happen where I had an incubator malfunction where it went to 113 degrees and it just cooked everything in there. And really tragically, there were jeweled chameleon eggs in the incubator, and it was at that temperature for about an hour. So it was hot. It's just, there's no way there's anything like that in the wild. It just cooked them. I assumed that was it. All the eggs would be fried. They hatched after that ridiculous temperature spike. And the babies were very small. On average, a well incubated baby is about 0.2 grams. That's a sweet spot I found that indicates they're going to be successful. These were 0.11. Very, very, very tiny, half the size. They hatched though, but they didn't work. They didn't really thrive. So I think getting them to hatch isn't necessarily the problem. If there's something so catastrophic like 113-degree temperature spike and they still hatch, I think hatch rate isn't the biggest indicator of success in that case. So as far as success after they hatch, it's near 100 with a couple of key exceptions like that, where clearly there was something wrong with the incubation. I think we need to look at long-term survivability as a measure of correct incubation rather than just hatching being a measure of correct incubation.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Folks, I'm sorry. We're going to have to close this off. But Michael, do you have any last words?
Um, yeah. So, oh boy, there's lots of stuff in the chat. I just wrote most of
That's why I opened up the can of worms there.
it. Darn. Well, anyway, we'll talk more. But no, I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk about them. I think they're absolutely stunning, and I do want to drill home a couple additional points here at the end. Is that Madagascar is open right now, and they reevaluate the quotas all the time. Like in 2020, Furcifer angeli was cut from the list entirely. We could lose these things any second, and frankly, we probably will. Maybe there's other people better qualified to say that than I am, but it's a good opportunity to work with the species now and get them established. I think they have a very bright future in captivity, and they're amazing to keep. I think these really deserve the effort, and they deserve the interest. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to keep them. So I'm delighted that there's community interest in this, and thank you so much for making this kind of publicly available information. One last thing I want to say is, despite what I just said, please do not buy any wild-caught chameleon as a pet. That is not the thing to do. What should be happening is every wild-caught that enters the country goes to a breeder and someone who has a vested interest and wants to put the work in to reproduce them. It's my sincere hope that this increased interest in the species does not lead to anyone buying a wild-caught animal because they think it looks interesting. So I really want to make that clear. Wild-caught animals shouldn't be kept as pets. And Frank Payne commented on that last time, and I thought that was such a key point to mention. Save for the breeders. Don't just buy them because they look good. Wait for the captive bred ones, which will be available.
Yes. And by the way, see that one on the right? That's my little girl. All right, Michael, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experience. We're definitely going to back around a little bit later, maybe in a year or so, and get an update as to how things are going. But until then, everybody, please, if you're interested in this species, go on the Facebook is the Furcifer campani community, or subscribe to this YouTube channel, because I'm going to be keeping an update, you all updated as to how we're doing. So everybody, see you later.